Hi everybody and welcome to today's lesson, which is about the poem Out Out by Robert Frost. Now I hope that you appreciate my Northern Irish accent when I say that title, because I'm going to say it quite a lot during today's video. Now, if you've never read anything by Robert Frost, you absolutely should. He's an amazing poet. He was writing about the turn of the 20th century towards the middle of the 20th century in New England and America, and he just writes the most beautiful descriptions of the natural landscape, but also of the lives of what we would call ordinary, everyday people and the tragedies that are experienced by those people. In this particular poem, Frost has set it in rural New England in the early 20th century, and it's based on a real event that happened to somebody in Frost's community. Now, I normally hesitate to interpret poems autobiographically because poets are often inspired by real events, but then layer on their own themes and symbolism and imagery and interests onto that. So I suppose the fact that it is a real life event is important in terms of what I'm going to say later, but I wouldn't interpret Frost's poetry entirely autobiographically. Now, in this poem, it starts off with the boy using a buzzsaw in the dying light. And a buzzsaw, if you're not familiar with this, is like a circular saw that you would have vertical in the middle of a table, and you would push the wood towards it and it would slice the wood in half. And at the time that we're talking about, there wouldn't have been much health and safety to do with this, so it wouldn't have had a guard. The boy probably wouldn't have been wearing any kind of protective clothing. And if you imagine a 13-year-old boy with a very dangerous saw in a shed or a barn on a farm on his own, you can see that inevitably something is going to go wrong here. So the boy's sister comes into the barn to call him for supper, and as the boy is distracted, he makes a mistake with the saw and he severs his own hand. The doctor arrives, he sedates the boy, but he's unable to save him. And the boy dies, but that's interestingly not the real tragedy of the poem. The real tragedy is that the people who survive forget the boy quite quickly and they move on with their own affairs. Now, I'm not going to read the poem to you for copyright reasons, so I suggest that you find it in another way. Pause the video, Google it, see what you can find, and then come back to this video in a minute. So I hope you've enjoyed reading the poem, and we're going to look at it informed by literary theory. And I don't want us to be led by the theory, I want us to be led by the poem, but I am going to use some kind of Marxist ideas as we're talking about it. And Marxists are normally interested in how writers have represented the class system. So we're looking at the situation of the working classes, of ordinary everyday people, and how difficult their lives are as they struggle to make a living. And as I say, I want us to be informed by this, not dominated by this theory. But if you are interested in finding out more about this, I've got lots of other videos where I talk about Marxism, so just have a look at those on YouTube elsewhere. So thinking about this idea of Marxism and Robert Frost, I want us to look at this quotation by a writer called Randall Jarrell. So I'll just take a second to read through this quotation on your own, and then I'll talk to you about it. Okay, so in this quotation, Jarrell talks about how Frost is interested in the actions of ordinary men. And I suppose this is what got me thinking about the idea of Marxism, that concern with the experiences of the working classes, their struggle to survive economically, the hardships that people can go through when they're in financially difficult circumstances. And it also prompted me to think about Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, in which Miller talks about the tragedy of the common man. And in Death of a Salesman, the main character, Willy Loman, is suffering at the hands of capitalism. He believes wholeheartedly in capitalism and the American dream and the idea that he's going to be able to create his own future. He's going to be economically solvent. He's going to be able to buy his family wonderful things and make them secure. And the tragedy of that play is that actually he's let down by that. And that's the tragedy of millions of people, not just in America, but all over the world every day. And so Marxism seems to be quite an appropriate way to talk about that. the other thing that interested me about this quotation from Jarrell is that he points out that Frost uses the rhythms of actual speech. So it's not just that he wants to represent the lives of ordinary people. He doesn't just want to represent the tragedy of the common man, but he wants to do that in a way that's accessible to everybody. And I think that's what makes Robert Frost's poems so popular with people, is that they are so kind of readily accessible, but at the same time they have such beauty and such depth in the language that you can just read them superficially, but after that you can really delve into them and analyse the language. Now, having said all of that about Marxism, to transform the intense psychological drama of Frost's poetry to a checklist of Marxist techniques would be really reductive, and I don't want to do that. However, we're going to hold that desire not to analyse it from a Marxist perspective in tension with the idea that reading modern American poetry, the concept of the American dream is always there. It always hovers at the edge of our conscious thought. And so one of the things that Frost does, as I read him anyway, it shows us that a capitalist worldview leads to blindness to the astonishing beauty of the natural world. And if you read a poem by Frost, such as Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening, there's this sudden realization that the natural world is such a beautiful thing. And actually, in our modern lives, busy every day, in cities, working all the time, we don't really notice that very often, and Frost wants to guide us towards that beauty. He also reveals capitalism's promise of a better life. You know, that idea that if you work a little bit harder, if you just do a little bit better, you'll get a little bit more money and then life's going to be so much better for you. But actually, what a lot of his protagonists realise is that there are small daily disappointments when this promise isn't fulfilled, when the American dream lets us down. And Frost also reflects on the lack of value placed on the individual. Now, this isn't unique to modern American existence. We find it in cultures all over the world. But what Frost really highlights to us is that when you're focused on survival, on economic survival or economic betterment, that actually the importance of the individual kind of pales in comparison to that financial imperative. So that's really kind of the profound central tragedy in Frost's poems, I find. So looking a little bit closer into the poem, the first couple of lines remind us of or introduce the symbolism of the buzzsaw. And what we have here is a juxtaposition between the mechanical image of the buzzsaw and then the softness of the natural breeze. And as in the opening of Death of a Salesman, we kind of know which way the poet's preferences are lying here. That's that celebration of nature and then the kind of harsh intrusion of the technological and mechanical object in that. And we have that echoed in the poetry, the music of the poetry as well. So the harshness of the repeated D sounds are juxtaposed with the sibilance of the description of the breeze. As well as that, we see the personification of the saw, which snarls and it rattles violently. And then we have the juxtaposition of the powerful saw with the vulnerable boy. And the boy's youth is really emphasised, and that sense of inevitability that something is going to go wrong here is quite clear. After that, we have this emphasis on work in the poem. So there's also an implied criticism of the parents. And the parents seem to have insisted that the child works until dinner without a break. And of course, if we take a step back and look at the context of the poem, there might be a financial imperative here which is forcing the parents to get their child to do work which to a modern mind is clearly unsuitable for him, but to do work without a break until dinner. Then at the end of the poem, there's the line which says that now that the boy has died, there's no more to build on there. And this suggests that life is perceived in relation to achievements, to financial gain. It's something that you build, and it implies that there's not necessarily any individual value in that boy's life, which is really part of the tragedy of the poem. So I guess the final point that I want to make about the text itself is actually going back to the start of it and looking at the title of the poem, which is a reflection on the fragility of life or the insignificance of life in modern America or modern capitalist society, if you want to put it like that. And the reason why I say that is because the title of the poem is an allusion to Macbeth's famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. And I know that some of you will be really familiar with this from your GCSEs. So I'll just read the speech and then we'll talk a little bit about why this particular speech is relevant to the poem. So Macbeth says, "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." So in this speech, Macbeth is reflecting on the fact that everything that he's aimed for, everything that he's tried to achieve in his life, has become meaningless. It's a very nihilistic speech. So Macbeth believes that he realizes the pointlessness of life. There's nothing after life for Macbeth. Even the idea of punishment and hell seems to have disappeared for him. And the whole thing is just one big sense of nothingness. And you'll see in the middle of the speech the out, brief candle phrase, which Frost alludes to. And so what Macbeth is imagining here is that life, Lady Macbeth's life, who's died in the previous scene, life is like a candle that can be blown out by a draft, that can burn out, that you have very little control over. And the extinguishing of the candle almost seems quite random sometimes. A sudden draft just blows that candle out. And Macbeth doesn't really understand this or maybe he does understand the cruelty of the universe that gives life, but then just takes it away so suddenly. And so when Frost alludes to this speech, what he's referring to is this idea that life is so fragile, it disappears so quickly, and it ultimately perhaps means nothing from a particular worldview. But as I've said already, what Frost is trying to do is point us towards a different worldview, that the recognition that this life that modern Americans are living is valueless, is pointless, it lacks importance, actually it's just a pale shadow of the life that they could have if they really appreciated the natural world and the importance of the individual. It's also really noticeable in Frost's poem that the boy is nameless, and again this links into the theme of the lack of value that he has. Similarly, the boy's death is almost ignored at the poem's conclusion. Everybody just moves on, and it's all about this insignificance. Life signifies nothing if your value system is a particular way, but if it's not, if you look at the natural world and you value that, and you value the individual, then Frost argues that actually there's a different way to live. So if you find this poem interesting, there's a few others that I want to point you to. So Robert Frost's Home Burial is a wonderful poem, and The Housekeeper, very interesting, bit longer, but very interesting poem. One of my absolute favourite poets, Elizabeth Bishop, is a wonderful poet to study. I love the poem Sestina, and again it's got this real sense of the tragedy and also the miraculous beauty in ordinary everyday life. She has a poem called The Moose, which is just absolutely wonderful. You should go and read it. Whether you're studying it or not, you should just read it because it is wonderful. And At the Fish Houses is a great poem too. There's another poem called The Fish. I could list lots and lots of Elizabeth Bishop poems because I do think she is fabulous. If you're researching these poets as well, there's a really good website, and I've put a couple of screenshots on the screen here. So this website specialises in American poets. You can find lots of the original texts, so copies of the poems, but also you'll see the second screenshot, there are links to critical essays about the poems as well, which might really help you in your research. So I hope this video has been useful for you, and make sure you check out the rest of the videos on this playlist.